This is Bob Oliphant from the Westford Historical Society and Museum, bringing you episode 50 of season 3 of the Westford Wardsman podcast. The Westford Wardsman newspaper was part of Turner's Public Spirit, a weekly newspaper in Ayer a century ago. In this episode, we'll be reading the Wardsman for the week ending Saturday, December 10th, 1910, and I'll elaborate on what was happening in Westford that week. The week starts with the Westford Center section. Since school was resumed after the short Thanksgiving recess, the pupils at the Frost School who live at a distance and stay through the noon hour are having their luncheon supplemented with the serving of hot soup or cocoa each day. As heretofore, this is supplied through the generosity of Mrs. John C. Abbott. The Edward M. Abbott Hose Company had their regular monthly meeting at their headquarters on Boston Road on Tuesday evening. There was a full attendance present. An appetizing supper in charge of Fred A. Smith was served, to which full justice was done. A committee was appointed to make arrangements for the annual dance to take place sometime in January. J. Herbert Fletcher and Robert Prescott went to Ludlow, Vermont last week, being gone the greater part of the week on a hunting trip, and have been kept busy recounting the results to their friends since their return. But I guess the newspaper folks didn't find out just what the results were. The memorial window at the Unitarian Church was put in place on Tuesday and Wednesday, preparatory to the dedication for Sunday. You may recall it was delayed in getting to Westford as per the last week's newspaper. Mrs. Lillian Lumbert has 3 of her little grandchildren from Oxford staying with her, and Miss Annie Blodgett is assisting in caring for them. The Ladies' Missionary Society of the Congregational Church held their regular monthly meeting on Tuesday afternoon in the vestry of the church, held in conjunction with the weekly prayer meeting. A good program from the program Missions in Central America was carried out. Mr. and Mrs. Edward Fisher's many friends are glad for them that their little daughter Esther is much better. She has had bronchitis and threatened pneumonia and under the care of Dr. Wells and a special nurse. The basketball game, which took place in the Academy Gymnasium between the Lowell Commercial College team and the Westford team on last Friday afternoon, resulted in very much of a defeat for the latter with a score of 34-7. The Westford team has good material but lacking training, and Mr. Jordan of the Commercial College team is to give them some special coaching preparatory to the schedule of games that Principal Dexter Coggeshall has arranged for the season. The students are also busy preparing for a minstrel show to be given later in the season. At the Middlesex North Pomona Grange, held last Friday in Lowell, the annual election of officers took place. Westford Grange has 2 representatives on its official staff, Mrs. Leonard Wheeler as Flora and Alonzo Sullivan as gatekeeper. Mr. and Mrs. Emery J. Whitney spent several days this week with friends in Lowell. The Donald M. Camerons have closed their Westford home and gone to Lowell for the remainder of the winter. Word has been received this week of the rounding up and arresting by the state police of 5 horse thieves, and our town officials have reason to think at least part of this gang had to do with the series of horse thefts that took place here not long ago. The bandstand has been removed from the common this week and stored in winter quarters. Next section is on the Grange. The annual election of officers was the business of the evening at the last meeting of the Grange. The following list of officers was chosen for the ensuing year: Frank C. Wright, Master; Mrs. David L. Grieg, Overseer; Miss Martha L. Grant, Lecturer; J. Henry Colburn, Steward; Fred Clement, Assistant Steward; Mrs. Leonard W. Wheeler, Treasurer; Mrs. Frank Wright, Secretary; Mrs. Fred Snow, Lady Assistant Steward; Miss Ruth Bonneau, Pomona; Mrs. J. Henry Colburn, Ceres; Mrs. Addie Day, Flora; Alonzo H. Sutherland, Gatekeeper; William R. Taylor, Executive Committee for 3 years. Mr. and Mrs. Frank Wright were chosen delegates to represent this Grange at the sessions of the State Grange to be held next week, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday at Worcester. Mrs. Josie A. Prescott was chosen as alternate, and Miss Martha Grant was chosen to represent our Grange at the Lecturers' Conference. Next, we have a section on temperance meeting. A union temperance service between the Graniteville Methodist Episcopal Church and the Unitarian Congregational, that is the First Parish Church in Westford, was held on Sunday evening at the latter church. It was very much of a success in the excellence of the service and the attendance, which was over 175. The men's quartet of the Graniteville Church furnished several fine selections, and the choir of the entertaining church sustained its part in the musical program with solo by Mr. Charles D. Colburn. The men's choir of Graniteville consists of Horace Conant, Henry Smith, Reverend Mr. Louis Havermel, and Alvin Nelson. Reverend Mr. Wallace read the scripture lesson and offered a prayer, and Reverend Mr. Havermel gave the address of the evening, which was a forceful and consistent presentation of the subject and held the close attention of the hearers. At the close of the meeting, the audience endorsed a resolve which was forwarded to the senator and representative-elect of this district, endorsing the bar and bottle bill and going on record as opposed to its repeal. The bar and bottle bill, passed by the Massachusetts legislature in May 1910, prevented holders of a first-class liquor license, which was for selling liquor at a bar for consumption on the premises, from holding a third-class license, which was for selling liquor for home consumption, at the same time. The effect was to interfere with the trade at saloons, where patrons were accustomed to buy liquor on Saturday night before closing to tide them through Sunday when the saloons were closed, and to boost the sale of liquor on Sundays at restaurants and hotels where drinks could be served with meals. Prohibitionists believed the net effect would be a reduction in drinking of alcoholic beverages. The move to repeal in 1910 and 11 failed. A meeting of like character is to be arranged later at the Graniteville Church. The next section is the About Town section. Amos Poley has just finished building a 2-story corn barn. He drew the design, and Matthew Smith of Brookside was carpenter executor. Mr. and Mrs. Nelson observed Thanksgiving the day before the governor's proclamation called for it. It is a girl baby. Ruth Eleanor Nelson, born November 23, 1910. All kinds now, 2 boys for previous joys. John O. Sundberg of West Chelmsford has moved into his new house on the Lowell Road at Brookside. This is the house built by Henry Harrington and adds credit to builder. Henry Harrington of Graniteville was a well-known local carpenter and house builder. Auntie Sarah Richardson at the old Fletcher homestead at Brookside has been ill since Thanksgiving with what seems to be cholera infantum, or would be if she were only 91 years younger. Dr. Wells is in attendance, and the infantum is departing. Miss Richardson is the oldest person in town and is likely to remain so. The furniture of her constitution is old New England endurance. Brookside mills are running on water time. As there isn't much water running, there isn't much mill running. Cheaper living, you know, just in sight, but it has shut off the steam whistle morn, noon, and night. The Brookside mills were located on Stony Brook in the Brookside area of town. Colonel Edwin D. Metcalf of Auburn, New York, has been elected president of the National Implement and Vehicle Association of the United States, with a combined capital of $700 million. Colonel Metcalf, you may recall, donated the Civil War monument and is in the process of donating the stained glass window behind the altar at the parish church. We'll hear more about that shortly. The unrestricted wide-open gun in the unrestricted wide-open season for the shooting of deer have given us these tender memories. 199 deer were reported killed, 97 were reported shot but not killed, 6 dead in the woods, which the hunters wounded but did not kill, 3 too badly wounded to stand up, and how much undiscovered suffering lies hidden in the thicket and glen may never be known. But these tender memories are ours, of Massachusetts with its societies for the prevention of cruelties to animals. This was undoubtedly written by Samuel Taylor, author of the About Town section of the Wardsman, who often spoke against hunting and any cruelty to animals, wild or domestic. Judge Harris, who has been holding equity court in Lowell, granted a divorce in the case of George E. Gould and Ida M. Gould, both of Westford, for cause of desertion. The case came up for hearing on December 1st. F.N. Chase has moved onto the Dagey farm on the Tenney Road just north of Kai's Pond. At present, he is looking after the interests of the moths of all kinds of personality that loiter on the public road and who have no visible means of support. That is not contrary to law. He's apparently the guy that takes care of the moths that nest in the trees in Westford in 1910. The Fortnightly Club held a business meeting at the Wright Schoolhouse building on Friday evening. This means Christmas for the winter start off. The next section is a death that's reported. Professor Charles Otis Whitman died in Chicago on Wednesday of pneumonia, aged 68 years. He will be remembered by Westford people and friends of Westford Academy, where he was preceptor from 1868 to 1872. Preceptor we would call principal. The next paragraph is on the memorial window service. The much written about and postponed about memorial window for the Unitarian Church will come to finals Sunday afternoon, December 11th. Services will commence at 2:15 with an organ recital by George R. Smith of Lowell, organist of the church. Reverend Benjamin H. Bailey, minister of the church, will on this occasion be prime minister of ceremonies. Reverend Edward A. Horton of Boston will give the address. Colonel Edwin D. Metcalf of Auburn, New York, also of the old Westford Academy training and donor of the memorial window in memory of his mother, she was Nancy Elizabeth Metcalf, maiden name Crook, who lived from 1822 to 1881, will also be present. The time is so close by the founding of this old First Parish Church that it is expected a large gathering will be present in this old historic edifice with its spire and architecture towards the skies. Reverend Edward Augustus Horton, mentioned here, was a renowned Unitarian pastor and chaplain of the Massachusetts Senate. He was also a trustee of Westford Academy and superintendent of schools in 1882, per Hodgman's History of Westford. The next section is called At Home. Edward E. Decatur is home at the old revolutionary Pelatiah Fletcher Decatur homestead on the Lowell Road. That's at 54 Lowell Road, and the home is still there. He has been with the American Bridge Building Company for several years, has seen California with its earthquakes and Utah with its irrigation and irritation. Of late, his headquarters have been Ogden, Utah. He started on Wednesday with his mother, Mrs. C.R.P. Decatur, for New Brunswick to visit relatives. That's where the Decatur family originated, the one that's in Westford anyway. The next section is Forge Village. Mrs. Lowther, one of the oldest and most highly respected residents, celebrated the 76th anniversary of her natal day on Wednesday, November 30th, at her home on Bradford Street. She received many callers during the day and accepted their congratulations. In the evening, a dainty supper was served in her honor, and to her great surprise, she received some valuable gifts in remembrance of the occasion. Her many friends extend the wish that she may continue in her present good health and live to enjoy many happy birthdays in the future. The choir of St. Catherine's Church, West Graniteville, held its weekly rehearsal at the home of its director, Mrs. Mary F. Hanley, on Central Street. now West Prescott Street, on Wednesday evening instead of at the church as usual. A gang of roofers are at work retarring the roofs of the mill belonging to the Abbott Worsted Company. The cellars for the new cottages to be built by the Abbott Worsted Company on Union Street, now East Prescott Street, are being dug, and in spite of the very cold weather, if the work continues as rapidly as it has started, it will not be very long before the frames are finished. The many friends of Mr. and Mrs. Victor Pigeon will be pleased to learn of the complete recovery of their little daughter from her illness of last week. Edward T. Hanley is having his house, which he recently purchased from Mr. Parsons, remodeled, and a new tenement will soon be ready for occupancy. Next section is titled A New Society. Through the efforts of Reverend A.L. Bumpus, pastor of St. Andrew's Mission, a society has been formed of young ladies to be known as the Girls Friendly Society, another link in the great chain of girl friendlies in America. This society is not only open to the young ladies of St. Andrew's Mission, but to all young ladies, no matter of what religion, so long as she is of a good moral character. At the first meeting held last week, Miss Edith Precious was chosen and duly elected as secretary. Mr. Bumpus has written to secure the services of a speaker to be present at the next meeting of the Society in Recreation Hall on Wednesday evening, December 14th, who will thoroughly explain the benefits and privileges of the Girls' Friendlies. There are at present 25 names on the membership roll. The next section is called An Enjoyable Supper. The Ladies' Sewing Circle held another of their enjoyable suppers on Wednesday evening, December 7th, in the form of an English tea party in Recreation Hall. The tables, in their immaculate whitenesses, were laden with the usual good things for which these suppers are famous, and was thoroughly enjoyed by all present. Supper was served from 6 to 8 o'clock, and the following ladies were kept busy in charge of the affair: Mrs. Richard Prescott, Mrs. Nelson Prescott, Mrs. Hugh Ferguson, Mrs. Fernald, Mrs. Bert Comey, Mrs. George Sanborn, Mrs. Harry Catchpole, Mrs. Lord, and Mrs. J. Carmichael. After supper, the floor was cleared and dancing under the direction of the young ladies of the mission was enjoyed until a late hour. Music for dancing was furnished by the Precious Orchestra of this village. The next section is entitled Christmas Tree Exercises. The children of St. Andrew's Sunday School, under the direction of Miss Teresa Lowther, its treasurer, and Miss Sarah Precious, the organist, are rehearsing for the annual Christmas tree exercises to be held by the Groton schoolboys in Recreation Hall Monday evening, December 19th at 7:30 o'clock. This is the principal event of the year for the little tots who are anxiously awaiting the arrival of Santa Claus. This year, on account of the difficulty he found coming down the chimney in the hall last year, Santa will descend the large chimney by the fireplace in the boys' recreation room. The next section is the Graniteville section, and the first item is an obituary. Mrs. Ida M. Wright, wife of Postmaster Walter C. Wright of this village, died at her home on Thursday night after an illness of a few days' duration, aged 45 years. She leaves a husband, a father, A.J. Sargent, and brother, Albert A. Sargent of Lewis, New York, and 3 sisters. The deceased was well and favorably known and beloved by all who had the pleasure of her acquaintance. She had not enjoyed the best of health for several months, but never complaining and attending to her duties at all times. Mrs. Wright was a member of the Ladies' Aid Society of the Methodist Church and for a long time acted as secretary. The funeral of Mrs. Wright was held at her home on Main Street, Graniteville, on Monday morning and was very largely attended, many being present from out of town. After the services, the funeral took the 105 train for Lowell, where the last sad rites were performed at the grave by Reverend Lewis F. Havermel. Burial was in the Lowell Cemetery. There was an unusually large display of beautiful floral offerings that bore mute testimony to the high esteem in which the deceased was held. The ushers at the house were C.G. Sargent Jr., J.B. Carmichael. The bearers were John B. Carmichael, Fred Reed, Andrew J. Johnson, and Charles Blodgett. That's the news in Westford for the week ending December 10th, 1910. Thank you for listening, and thanks to Ryan Cousins of WestfordCAT for providing technical support. You can find transcriptions and podcasts from the Wardsman at our website at museum.westford.org or visit the Historical Society's Facebook page for more Westford news from days gone by. This is Bob Oliphant, and I hope you will join us for next week's Westford Wardsman podcast. Thank you.